What's up, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Glove Zone Boxing. And today, I want to dive deep into what I believe is next for Jake Paul because we've now had enough time pass since the Mike Tyson spectacle that went down a couple of months ago. And while that event was more about entertainment and less about high-level boxing competition, there's no denying that it was a massive win on the business front, pulling in an incredible audience of over 125 million viewers and bringing eyes to boxing from demographics that otherwise wouldn't be tuning in. And while the spectacle may not have lived up to traditional boxing purists' expectations, the event's commercial success opened the door to a historic potential partnership between MVP and Netflix, which could very well be one of the major turning points in how boxing is broadcast and consumed globally. And you also have to credit Jake and his team for stacking that card with meaningful bouts, including a fantastic women's boxing showcase between Amanda Serrano and Katie Taylor, which was an absolute war and delivered one of the best rematches in recent women's boxing history, as well as appearances from solid names like Mario Barrios and the rising Naraj Goyat, showing that despite Jake's own fight often being the circus centerpiece, the undercards are starting to carry more legitimate boxing weight. And this is part of Jake's broader strategy to build MVP as a promotion that not only puts him in the spotlight, but gives a platform to younger fighters and underrated divisions. So now that the dust has settled from the Tyson bout, we are naturally entering the season where speculation is running rampant around who Jake will fight next, because we're now about 2 months removed from the last bout, and Jake has already teased on social media that a major announcement was supposed to come in January, and now we're well into that month and still haven't heard anything concrete. And I've been hearing a lot of rumors floating around involving big names and potential shock matchups, but I'm going to break down why the most realistic and sensible next fight for Jake Paul is a rematch with Tommy Fury. And to make that case, we have to start with the main criticism that continues to follow Jake wherever he goes, which is the persistent narrative that he hasn't fought a real boxer at his age and weight since the Tommy Fury fight, which is, ironically, the only professional boxer he has faced and the one fight where he did not emerge victorious. And while Jake has said repeatedly that it was an off night for him, that he had bad preparation, and that he wasn't at 100%, you can't ignore the fact that he lost. And no matter how thick-skinned you are or how little you claim to care, that kind of loss, especially being the first one, can stay in the back of your mind and linger. And I don't doubt Jake's confidence or his mental resilience, but anyone in his position, especially one who has built a brand around shocking the world and proving doubters wrong, would want the opportunity to redeem themselves and rewrite that part of their story. And on Tommy's side of things, you also have to take into account his decision to pull out of a scheduled fight with Darren Till, which raised a lot of eyebrows because it wasn't due to injury or visa issues, but simply because of something Darren Till said during a press conference, which Tommy himself brought up in the first place. And that is very atypical behavior in the fight game, especially coming from a member of the Fury family who have long branded themselves as fighters through and through, willing to scrap anywhere, anytime. And it's incidents like that that make you wonder whether Tommy is trying to free himself up for another big money bout. And if you follow the money trail, it makes perfect sense that he would be seeking the Jake Paul rematch. And not long after that cancellation, we saw Tommy calling out Jake on Instagram, and the two traded barbs on Twitter, which is always a reliable indicator that something is cooking behind the scenes. And even more telling was the MVP Promotions account liking Tommy's post about coming back with a new mindset, which mirrors the digital flirting that happened during their first set of negotiations. And while that might seem like a small thing, we've seen this exact pattern before, and it often precedes real talks and real contracts. And now let's look at why this rematch makes sense, not only financially and from a promotional standpoint, but also from a competitive and legacy perspective for Jake Paul, because since the Tommy fight, Jake has fought 5 times, but let's be honest, none of those fights had the fans buzzing with anticipation or wondering if Jake was going to lose. And a big part of Jake's rise was that people genuinely believed there was a chance he would get beat, and that created intrigue, whether it was Ben Askren, who despite being a wrestler was still seen as an experienced fighter, or Tyron Woodley, who was a legitimate former UFC champion, or even Anderson Silva, a legend in the sport. All of those bouts had an air of uncertainty and risk, and that narrative helped drive interest. But since the Tommy fight, the matchups have felt a little safer, a little more one-sided, and while they may have served a developmental purpose for Jake, As a fighter, they didn't serve the story that got people invested in the first place, which was that Jake was doing the unthinkable, fighting real threats with real danger and walking away with wins, and now the Tommy rematch offers a return to that kind of narrative because it's a fight where people can genuinely see Jake losing again, and that brings back the stakes and the tension that made his earlier fights such must-watch events, and at the same time Jake is a better fighter now than he was when he first faced Tommy, and while Tommy hasn't been nearly as active, Jake has been under the lights 5 times since that first clash, which matters because activity in boxing isn't just about staying in shape, it's about staying mentally sharp under pressure and getting used to executing your game plan in front of a live audience and under the scrutiny of millions of viewers, and that's not something you can replicate in sparring or training no matter how hard you go. And Jake has gone through that experience repeatedly since the Fury loss, and while the opponents may not have always been top tier, those reps under pressure count, and meanwhile Tommy has only fought once since then, and it was a forgettable performance against KS that left a lot of fans underwhelmed, and if we're being honest, neither Jake nor Tommy were satisfied with how their first fight played out because while Tommy got the win, he didn't dominate or deliver the knockout he promised. And going to a split decision with a YouTuber who started boxing just a few years ago is not exactly the statement a lifelong fighter wants to make, and for Jake it was a fight that slipped away more than a fight he was outclassed in, and now, after 2 years of refining his technique, working with his team, and focusing on fundamentals that he never had the chance to develop due to jumping into training camps instead of building a traditional boxing foundation, Jake is probably at his best point yet to revisit this matchup, and you also have to factor in the psychology of redemption because Jake has built a brand not just as a boxer, but as someone who overcomes odds and reclaims control of the narrative, and this rematch is a textbook example of that because it's not just about proving he's a better boxer, now it's about proving that the loss didn't define him and that he has grown beyond the version of himself that fell short in that first meeting and strategically. This fight makes sense now more than ever because Tommy is at his most beatable right now with limited recent experience and the kind of distractions that come with personal changes like the end of his relationship with Molly May, which certainly had financial and emotional ripple effects, and add to that the pressure of being in the spotlight without a buffer fight to shake off the ring rust, and it creates the kind of opening Jake would be wise to exploit. And speaking of performance, let's break down some of Jake's improvements because while there are still weaknesses in his game, particularly in his cardio and defense, his footwork, his jab, and his left hook have improved significantly, and those tools are going to be crucial if he wants to deal with Tommy's length and reach because in the first fight Tommy was able to control distance fairly easily and Jake struggled to get on the inside and land clean, but now with better footwork and sharper punch selection he has a real shot at closing that gap and making this a much more competitive bout. And you can't ignore the psychological component either because the first fight took place in Saudi Arabia in front of a relatively quiet and limited crowd, and Jake handled that environment, but when Tommy fought KSI in Manchester in front of a packed house, he looked rattled and never really got into rhythm, and that's something Jake could capitalize on by staging the rematch in a bigger, louder venue where the pressure is higher and the lights are hotter because Jake thrives in that chaos while Tommy seems to shrink a bit under it. And then you have to think about the weight class because Jake has dabbled in heavyweight territory, but he's made it clear that he's not a natural heavyweight and feels more comfortable closer to cruiserweight, and for this rematch, that's likely where the fight would be contracted, which would benefit Jake's speed and stamina and allow him to maintain a higher volume of punches. And while Tommy probably walks around heavier, he hasn't shown the kind of power that makes you think Jake can't handle it, especially with the muscle Jake has added in the last year, which if properly conditioned into explosive fast-twitch strength, Jake Paul's physical transformation could become a real asset in his continued evolution as a boxer. And while critics often point to recent performances like the Mike Perry exhibition or the Nate Diaz bout as examples where Jake didn't necessarily look his best, it's important to take a step back and understand the broader context because not all fighters allow you to look good due to the nature of their styles and engagement in the ring. And in the case of Mike Perry, you're dealing with a guy who comes from an MMA brawling background, bringing unpredictable angles, lead overhands, and gritty exchanges that don't lend themselves to clean traditional boxing. And similarly, with Nate Diaz, you get someone who, while being an icon in MMA, is awkward in his own right with a slapping boxing style that lacks traditional form, but is tough, durable, and difficult to time or cleanly outbox, so what ends up happening in fights like those is that the opponent dictates a lot of the tempo and forces Jake into moments where he looks like he's underperforming or struggling to find rhythm and flow, and those fights aren't necessarily a reflection of regression in Jake's skill set, but rather a limitation in the way his opponent's style neutralizes clean execution, and this is a reality in boxing across all levels. Even elite boxers have had performances where they've looked less than stellar simply because the person across from them wasn't the right foil to bring out their best, and that's why when you look at Jake Paul's performance against Andre August, you begin to see a sharper, more focused, and composed boxer who displayed elements of what he's been developing behind the scenes, whether that's improved jab timing, better balance, more selective shot placement, or simply better ring generalship. And in that fight, August, while not being a world beater, brought more of a conventional boxing style and stood in the pocket just enough to allow Jake to work and establish some offensive rhythm, and that rhythm matters because Jake is not at the level where he can override chaos with pure talent just yet. He needs structure to showcase what he's built, and August provided just enough of that to let Jake look technical and in command, which is a sign of growth and maturity in his process. And as we now shift our attention to a potential rematch with Tommy Fury, the dynamics change again, because unlike Perry or Diaz, Tommy is a traditional boxer through and through, with a jab-focused attack, long reach, decent footwork, and a willingness to stay at range and build behind the basics, which means that if Jake really has made the improvements he's claimed, whether in punch mechanics, foot positioning, defensive movement, or overall IQ, then this is the opponent who will make those things more visible and more relevant, because it will be a match of styles where the better execution wins. And that's why the Tommy Fury rematch is not only intriguing, but necessary, because in many ways it serves as a checkpoint in Jake's career where we get to evaluate his trajectory since that pivotal loss and see whether their last 2 years have been a period of meaningful growth or just safe matchmaking and surface-level adjustments. And again, to be clear, I don't view this as a guaranteed win for Jake, far from it. In fact, it's a 50-50 fight, and both men have realistic paths to victory. Tommy with his length, jab, and basic fundamentals, combined with his own hunger to prove he's more than just a Love Island celebrity with a famous last name, and Jake with his physicality, ring IQ, power, and increasing boxing foundation. It's a clash that will tell us who's made the bigger leap since their first encounter. And let's not forget the narrative weight behind this rematch, because if Jake wins, he erases the most glaring criticism that's followed him since his boxing debut, and that's the claim that the first time he fought a real boxer, he lost. And while some will always move the goalposts, at least this time the answer will be less ambiguous, because it's the same opponent under presumably better conditions and with the excuse of bad preparation off the table. And if Jake loses again, then maybe he just isn't what his team has tried to build him into, and that's fine too. But either way, clarity is what fans deserve, and the sport benefits when we have resolution to big questions. And for Tommy, a win here means solidifying himself as a legitimate boxer with commercial upside, and not just the guy who did enough to scrape by an internet star. It gives his career direction, money, and marketability, and allows him to create a real lane for himself independent of Tyson Fury and Molly May and whatever distractions come with the reality TV orbit. And from a business standpoint, this is the kind of matchup that sells itself easily. Big names, a personal rivalry, a built-in narrative, and plenty of media interest from both sports and entertainment corners. And while some hardcore boxing fans may dismiss it as a novelty act, the truth is this is the kind of fight that gets people talking and eyes watching, and that's ultimately what moves boxing forward, because whether you love Jake or hate him, the impact he's had on the sport's visibility is undeniable. And with Netflix now flirting with the space after the Tyson fight, pulling in reportedly over 100 million viewers, there's a real chance this becomes part of a broader movement to bring boxing to new platforms and audiences. And a Jake Paul versus Tommy Fury to fight would be the perfect marquee event to follow up that momentum, and the timing feels right because Jake is due for an announcement. He's been teasing one since December, and January is now well underway with no clear opponent revealed, and the online back and forth between Jake and Tommy, combined with MVP's subtle social media signals, liking Tommy's posts and echoing familiar patterns from the last time these two fought, suggests that something is brewing behind the scenes. And if the rematch happens, it won't just be about revenge, it will be about redemption, progress, exposure, and future opportunity for both men. And to me, this is the most logical fight on the table, considering what each man brings and where they are in their careers. Jake has been active. Tommy Has not Jake has made changes? Tommy appears stagnant. Jake's name is hotter now than ever. Tommy's marketability could use a bump, and more than anything else, the timing creates the right pressure cooker for a truly competitive showdown. And if I had to guess, I think Jake is quietly confident that the version of him today beats the version of Tommy that shows up, and if he's right, he changes the entire conversation around his place in boxing and silences a lot of the narrative that has chased him for years. And even if he loses again, as long as he performs well and gives a better showing than the first time, there's value in that, because boxing careers are built on arc and progress and not just wins and losses. And I think Jake has figured that out, which is why we've seen a shift in his tone from showman to student over the past year and a half, and all those quiet gym hours, all that fundamental drilling, the sparring with seasoned pros, and the grind that doesn't go viral on social media. Those things will either pay off here or be exposed, and that's why I'm excited, because we're finally at a place where Jake Paul's next move isn't just about who sells the most pay-per-views or what name looks good on a poster, but what fight actually matters in terms of testing his growth. And I believe the Tommy Fury rematch is exactly that, and until we get that fight, the question mark remains too big and the narrative too easy to dismiss him with. So let's see if they make it official in the coming days, because from where I sit, it looks like all the stars are aligning, and if the fight happens, it will be one of the most talked about boxing events of the year, with real stakes, real tension, and a lot to prove for both men. And whether you love him or hate him, Jake Paul has brought something fresh to the sport, and now it's time to see if that something can stand up under real pressure in a fight that actually matters. Thanks for tuning in, and I'm looking forward to what's next in this wild journey that is Jake Paul's boxing career.
What's up, guys? Make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, like the video, and hit the bell icon to stay updated with all my latest content. More awesome videos coming soon. Stay tuned.